This Ciampi lecture given to us by Priska Daphi, who I welcome once again to Cosmos and the Scuola Normale. Priska has been working on several aspects of social movements. She comes from a PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin and then developed her career in two important institutions in Frankfurt and now in Bielefeld. She has been working on different aspects of social movements that are quite relevant also in our faculty, from the analysis of memories, cultural elements, networks, comparison of the global justice movements and other movements. She has also been engaged in several institutional activities in the social movement studies areas, from the ECPR standing groups to the now editing of the social movement studies, which is an important journal in social movements. She will today address the peace movement, the evolutions of the peace movement. Peace movement is one movement that has been a bit of a silence in social movement studies because it had been studied especially during moments of high mobilizations, but less during periods of declining mobilizations, and it has been analyzed only sporadically. And this is also why with Priska here we are planning to develop a project on the recent development of the peace movement in several European countries. And so this lecture will be one of the milestones, initial milestones for the development also of this project, looking at ways in which networks changed, forms of actions and repertoires change, and also the frame and the meaning of peace has been developed and contested. So Priska, welcome once again, and please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Also, thanks again for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be a Ciampi visiting fellow here at Scuola Normale. I hope I can keep up with the expectations of setting a milestone in our research on the peace movement, or on research on the peace movements more generally. What I'll talk in this lecture about is the evolution of the peace movements, as you see in the title. What I'll do is, of course, the evolution of a peace movements could be understood in various ways. I'll focus, perhaps not surprisingly, given my disciplinary background, on the post-war developments, and even further specific and further even more current, I'll focus on some developments in the last years, set against the background of the more general developments of post-war peace mobilizations. The peace movement, of course, has a very long history that goes well beyond Second World War, but this will not be part of this talk. We know that there's valuable historical studies on the early pacifist groups and building in the 90s and early 20th century, and allow me to refer to these for the even longer term perspective than my talk will cover. Another note on my talk, and perhaps a bit of a disclaimer, the subject of this talk is rather a fresh subject. So we started working with my team on the peace movement starting from last year, and we just got funding for a project, a 3-year project that will start next year, just to situate this talk a bit. So I hope you excuse that I'll focus on some of them kind of more current developments also with this respect. What will I do in the next minutes? I'll first talk about the 4 major cycles of peace mobilizations in Europe since the post-war, or in the post-war period till the early 2000s, pointing to some general changes, for example, with the end of the Cold War. Then I'll go in a second part over to the newest wave of peace mobilizations that we've seen in the recent years, and you will not be surprised to hear the words Ukraine and Israel-Hamas conflict in this context. And then I'll go to the more specific developments of the peace movement in Germany, and talk about something that I call a bit of a peculiar development in the last years in peace mobilizations in Germany, particularly in the context of the Ukraine war. So let's start with the first part. When we talk about the peace movement, it's not too easy to talk about a joint development here, right? As various scholars on peace movements have stressed, the strength and the specific features of the peace movements, they vary quite strongly across Europe depending on different national contexts. And of course, this includes different also political regimes, cleavage structures, and other kind of, let's say, movement traditions that of course affect the peace mobilizations across Europe. And I'll come back to some of the comparative studies that do exist on earlier waves of peace mobilizations, such as in the 80s and in the early 2000s, to show some of these differences. So due to this diversity, as I said, it's hard to talk about the peace movement in Europe, and some kind of common trends. There are some trends, and I'll talk about them, but they're not too hard, too easy to pin down. What many scholars have done, and what I will do too, is talk about 4 major waves of mobilization across Europe that in a way joined the different peace mobilizations across Europe, right? Even though, and this is again perhaps a bit of a disclaimer, this means that we'll focus disproportionately on the level of protest events. And I need to point out here, I think, that there's of course a broad array of peace activism that is not happening on the street, in particular after the Cold War, where a lot of peace activism has taken place in what some scholars would consider more prefigurative action, direct social action, for example, in the context of peace pedagogy, peace teaching, right? So this is something that perhaps will get a bit too little attention in the next couple of slides, just to warn you. So the 4 waves, not perhaps surprisingly, that scholars identified till the early 2000s are a cycle in the 50s with the opposition to atmospheric nuclear tests across Europe, an opposition in the 80s till 85 against, again, also nuclear weapons, in particular the deployment of the Pershing II and the cruise missiles in different European countries in those years. And the third one, the opposition to the Gulf War, which constituted another very important cycle in 1990 and 91. And the fourth one is the one, the protests against the Iraq War, which increased peace mobilizations significantly. Across these 4 mobilizations, there are some commonalities. And I come to the differences in a second, but the commonality, very broadly speaking, that scholars have identified is generally the critique of imperial behavior in these phases, and specifically the role of the US and the role of the US in matters of international security. But there are substantial differences, and in the next couple of minutes I'd like to talk about some of them and go through these different phases in more detail. To do so, I've again relied, like last week, relied on some protest event data that colleagues have put together, a data set by Crisi and Grande et al. That allows us to see some of the developments across time, even though with a focus, as you see, on Western Europe, right? So there are several countries here in this kind of temporal comparison that are not included. Also, as you see, it starts in the 70s, so this first earliest wave of anti-nuclear protest, you can't see it in this graph, but you see some of the other developments quite nicely. First of all, of course, the very strong wave of anti-nuclear protests in the 80s, And one of the commonalities in these first two phases, the 50s and the 80s, is of course a focus on nuclear weapons, right? This is very, very prominent here, and it's less prominent for the others. The nuclear disarmament, the issue of nuclear disarmament was very strong in the 50s, but it got a completely new and larger dimension in the 80s, which you not only see in the number of protests, okay, now you can't compare them, but I can tell you, not only the number of protests and participants, but also in the number of countries that were involved on the issue of anti-nuclear or nuclear disarmament. And this, of course, followed the decision in '79 of the NATO to deploy the missiles, the cruise and the Pershing missiles in 5 Western European countries, Belgium, Great Britain, Italy, Netherlands, and West Germany. And there was a huge mobilization in these countries, but not only in these countries, in these 5, but also beyond this. And the result was one of the largest waves of protest across Europe so far. And indeed, this is why many scholars of social movements have stressed that actually peace movements have been the protagonist of this wave or of this period of time in the Western world and in Europe. And indeed, as I said, in terms of number, you do see that these have been very large events, at least in the countries that are covered in this graph, right? And I'll come back to some of the differences because, for example, here in Italy, the protests in the 90s and early 2000s were bigger than the ones in the 80s. So this is something that might give here the graph might perhaps give a bit of also a skewed impression, right? There's other differences for the 80s protests. And they've been pointed out, for example, in a publication in a book by Hans-Peter Krisi in 1905, where he compared the different peace protests across Europe, he and his colleagues. And he led back some of the differences that he found between the different countries to the different cleavage structures in these countries, with the argument, perhaps not too surprisingly for many of you here, that peace protests in the 80s were particularly strong in countries where the classical class and religious cleavages were more pacified, were less dominant, and where other cleavages, including about peace, were more able to take a larger room. And this is the reason why, for example, and you see it in this graph too, why in Germany and the Netherlands, you've witnessed much stronger mobilizations in the 80s than, for example, in France. You see it quite nicely here. France is the turquoise one, right? Very few mobilizations in the 80s, right? Both in terms of events, that's the upper one, as well as in terms of participants, that's the lower graph. And you see in later phases, for example, in early 2003, many more protests on peace in France. And this is something that, for example, you also, I've mentioned, see in Italy, where numbers of participants and events increase significantly in this later phase after the 1990 of mobilization. Also the third cycle, the protests against the Gulf War in 1991, you see it in the graph here. You do see it's smaller, at least for those countries covered here, and it has been short-lived, rather short-lived. And this is something that also shows quite clearly here in the data with a clear peak in 91, and then it's going down quite quickly again. Here, of course, the background is the US intervention in the Persian Gulf, with the Gulf driving out Iraq out of Kuwait, and this called out a huge or a relatively large resistance across Europe. It's important to note that this cycle of protest is taking place in a different setting, right? And that's a post-Cold War setting in 1991. And as various scholars on peace mobilizations have stressed, of course, the post-war situation has changed the conditions and the context for peace mobilizations considerably. As, for example, the Italian scholar Russa points out, that with this with the fall of the Berlin Wall, peace movements had to deal with not once with not several superpowers, but one superpower, and wars that were increasingly presented as guided by moral motives, right? And so this gives, as you can imagine, quite a different context for peace mobilizations. Some scholars have highlighted that peace mobilizations, as a result, have moved from a focus more of kind of East-West conflicts to a growing focus on North-South conflicts and differences. Also, I've stressed this before, peace movements that focused in the 50s and 80s very much on nuclear disarmament, moved away from this focus on nuclear issues, focused more on the opposition of military interventions for various reasons, including humanitarian interventions. And this is something that we also see in the later 90s, of course, with the opposition to the Kosovo War. And this is, again, something that is perhaps a bit underrepresented in this graph, because these were mobilizations that were not so big in the countries involved here in the graph, but that were big in other countries, including in Italy, where you saw a very large wave of protests against the Kosovo War. The fourth phase, and there's a lot of literature on that one too, are the protests in 2003 against the war in Iraq. You see again in the graph too a clear increase. You see a bit of a different, in particular if you look at the participants, a different constellation of countries where, as I said earlier, some countries have become more involved in these mobilizations, including Great Britain. This protest was, again, against the military intervention led by the US. Here it is important to note that another kind of seismic shift in the political constellation has taken place with the post-9/11 world situation. And of course, also this changed the conditions for peace movements too. Scholars have stressed that it has increased the kind of, after some decreasing peace protests and mobilization, the centrality of traditional pacifist themes, but at the same time it has also complicated things in terms of the stance towards the NATO and the US and some anti-Americanism that has been in a part of peace mobilizations for a long time. Right? As I mentioned, there are several studies on the protest against the Iraq War, including an international research project where these protests protesters were surveyed in various countries, across 8 countries in Europe and in the US. And there's a nice book edited by Dieter Rucht and Walgraf about this, so in case you're interested, this is a very nice read. And what this book, among others, showed is that the kinds of alliances that supported the protests in 2003 looked rather different across Europe. Not surprisingly, again, the context in each, the political context in each country is different. But nonetheless, I'd like to point out some of these trends. So one of the things they found is that that Italy, Spain, and Netherlands had actually quite the broadest alliances in these protests in terms of different actors coming together, including political parties, trade unions, peace groups, of course, too, but then also various political groups, progressive groups that were not primarily or previously dealing with peace, right? And this, as I said, was particularly the case in Italy, Spain, and Netherlands, as countries were where the governments were supporting the war, right? There were narrow alliances in the war-leading countries, the US and the UK, and in countries where the government was critical of the war, such as in Germany, Belgium, and Switzerland. Actually, the scholars find that actually the alliances have been a bit narrow, right, in these contexts, as they were not a more kind of general opposition to government, and as such were narrow, focused more on groups that were already dealing with peace issues, not exclusively. Also in other countries, of course, parties came into it and trade unions, but what they find in this comparative setting, that the alliances in Germany, Belgium, and Switzerland were narrower than in Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. And they were the narrowest in the UK and the US, just to kind of round off this point. Now, the interesting thing is that after 2003, not only peace mobilizations went down considerably, but also research about peace mobilizations went down considerably, and you were referring to this in the beginning. There's very little that you can find, and in a way, you notice that my talk is a bit about both the events as well as the research that's there. But as I mentioned, of course, it wasn't inexistent in these phases. There were more kind of direct social actions related to peace. Of course, I'm not trying to say there was nothing on peace going on, but for a great part, many peace groups and networks that still exist went into a phase of abeyance. And now what we see most recently, and this is what I'd like to come now in the second part of my presentation, are a new wave of mobilizations, a very recent one. First of all, the protest in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which started in the end of February 2022, and directly very spontaneously in reaction to this invasion, there were a lot of protests going on across Europe, right? Often quite spontaneously organized. In Germany, for example, there were about 100,000 people in Berlin and even more in Cologne, with about 250,000 people protesting against the war, against the aggression against Ukraine, and in solidarity with Ukraine. And there were protests with several thousand participants across Europe too, including in the UK, France, Finland, and also Eastern European countries such as Poland and Estonia, with very large protests. And what I've included here in this slide is a map that Al Jazeera put together very early, though, I have to say. So they put this together at the end of February 2022. So what you see here is this big wave of very fast mobilizations in direct reaction to this invasion at the end of February, and they continued in March 2022. Right? This is what you see in this upper map. After this, there has been a varying, protests against the war in Ukraine with varying sizes and quite different across Europe, often in the context of traditional peace movement mobilizations, such as the Perugia-Assisi March in Italy, or the Easter marches in Switzerland and Germany. So here you've seen, of course, in these kind of traditional, recurrent peace events that Ukraine came up. And what I would describe that there was a kind of second big wave or bigger wave of peace protests on the occasion of the first anniversary of the invasion. So that was in February 2023. It wasn't as big as the first one, though. Right? I looked at some of the figures, and it wasn't as big as that. And my impression is also that it was more differentiated, with groups that previously joined together, now no longer mobilizing together. And I'll come back to that with respect to Germany in a second. And then, of course, the second newest wave of peace mobilizations are the protests still ongoing in the context of the most recent Israel-Hamas conflict, following the terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7. And here, again, I included a map that Al Jazeera put together, also very early in the event. This map was put together on the 16th of October, right? So it gave a couple more days to collect data, if you will, than the peace ones or the Ukraine ones, but still. So this is the early picture of I have to say these are so these are protests against the attacks, the bombing of Gaza, right? So these are Palestinian protests, because at the beginning of this conflict, there were also across Europe some pro-Israel protests, but these have been kind of declining with the growing military action of Israel. These protests brought together across various larger cities in Europe about a couple of thousand in the early phases, but the development is still very dynamic and still growing. we've seen that they have grown, for example, in the UK, from several 10,000 to several 100,000, the protests in size. And the recent event in the UK is, maybe you followed it, on Saturday, on the occasion of the Armistice Day. In the UK, there were about 300,000 to 800,000 participants, 300,000 according to police, 800,000 according to the organizers that protested for the stop of the bombing of Gaza and in solidarity with Palestinian people. But we've also seen protests, not as big as this, but protests, as I said, of several 10,000 in other countries, and there's still a rather dynamic development that deserves research. And as Donatella mentioned, one of the things that we plan to do is comparing the constellation of actors and the coalitions in the protest against the Ukraine war and now the Israel-Hamas war, across different countries. Allow me now to come to the third part of my presentation and to some perhaps rather specific developments in the context of the current German peace movement that, as I said, we now have a chance to study for a longer period because Larissa, Maya, and me, we applied for some funding, and we recently were granted a research grant to study this, the German peace movement for the next 3 years. And what I'll talk about, I mentioned it before, is a bit of a peculiar situation in the last years, and I'll try to, in a rather, as I mentioned, in a context of rather fresh research, to make sense of them. But before I do, let's also here take a brief look back, because, and again, here I'll refer to some protest event analysis, this time based on the German protest event data set ProDat that was put together by Dieter Rucht and others. And what you see here is from the 50s till 2000. Again, on the top you see the events, and on the bottom you see the participants. You see here, of course, the similar trends that we've already identified for the 4 waves across Europe. You see, in addition, because this data set starts a bit earlier, you see the protests in the early 50s, and you might notice in the beginning, it's almost hidden, in the beginning of the 50s, you see a very large number of participants, and this has to do with the large protest against general rearmament in Germany, right? Some other things that perhaps you see that are different from the general trends that we discussed earlier are quite a considerable number of protests that are addressing peace in the context of the 60s. Right? This is something that varies across European countries, but in Germany the 60s were very much, or protests within the 60s also addressing issues of peace, as you see here, but you also see that the number of participants wasn't particularly big, right, on the lower graph. You see, as in the other comparative graph, you see, well, the big wave in the 80s, then also the big one in 91, right? This is one of the highest number of events that you see here. And then quite some slowing down of protests. What you do not see here are the 2003 protests against the war in Iraq. Also here, I mentioned, there were strong mobilizations in Germany in 2003, with about 500,000 people coming together on February 15, 2003. It was one of the biggest single peace events in German history. Now, I mentioned earlier that the coalition backing these protests was narrower than in other countries, and the protests also were smaller than in other countries where they exceeded 1 million of participants, right? Nonetheless, it was a big event, but as the book on the Iraq protest perhaps a bit ominously stated, that actually previous waves of peace mobilizations are not necessarily an indicator of, or a predictor of the strength of following peace mobilizations. And with this kind of ominous statement, I'd like to start my exploration of some of the current developments in the German peace mobilizations. Exactly, and those are in particular in the context of the Ukraine war. And my major point is here that while there have been big protests, and I mentioned them briefly, I'll come back to them in a second, there have been big protests in direct reaction to the invasion in February 2022, and there have also been big protests for peace in Ukraine later on. However, the traditional peace movement in Germany has played a rather marginal role in these events, right? So there have been big protest events, but what we call the kind of traditional network of peace groups that still exists, and of progressive peace groups, has played not a central role in them. And I'm talking here about, in particular, a rather low mobilization capacity. So there have been events organized by the traditional peace groups, but they have been rather small in size. For example, the Easter marches that have been rather small. And they have also received a lot of criticism, right? So the claims of the peace movement have received a lot of criticism. Within the general German public, again, a bit of context, the German government has approved, in reaction to the Ukraine war, a major change in foreign policy, right? With a big package of, or with big weapons deliveries and a significant increase for military spending. And these are policy changes that have been described within the scholarly literature that without the invasion would have taken years to formulate, right? So these are big changes in foreign policy, and there have been heated debate about this, but at the same time there has been a very strong support of these measures by the political elites, or by the big part of the political elites, and also by the biggest part of the public, right? There are surveys that still show that the majority agrees with arms delivery, and only about a quarter thinks that this is actually going too far in public opinions. Right? Let's look into the situation a bit more in detail. As I mentioned, initially in March 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, there were broad big protests with about 100,000 in Berlin, and I said 250,000 in Cologne. So big protests that included a variety of groups, including trade unions and political parties, and also including various peace groups. Right? But after that will be my argument, a kind of more differentiated picture has emerged, with a variety of different protests mobilizing for peace in Ukraine. And I'd like to talk about them briefly. So one is the protests in solidarity with Ukraine that are in favor of continuing weapons deliveries and that are defending the right to self-defense for Ukraine, right? But they do make certain peace claims because they say we are for a just peace, right? And they oppose, and I'll talk about this in a second, some of the traditional peace movement stances or claims for an immediate ceasefire because they say this is not the way that a just peace can be achieved. Right? And the Green Party, as we'll see, has been very much involved in these protests. Then we have protests by traditional peace movements, for example, in the context of the Easter marches that are calling for a start in diplomatic negotiations and an immediate or at least a soon ceasefire and a stop of weapons delivery. Right? Thirdly, we have something that I'll call hybrid protests on peace. And this is perhaps a bit of a peculiar development that some of you might be aware of, others don't. The second largest protests, peace protests that were taking place, the biggest ones were the biggest ones after 2022, right? So I'm talking now about the protests in the end of 2022, early 2022. And the biggest ones are the Just Peace ones with about 120,000 people participating on the first anniversary of the invasion. The second biggest one are the ones by the hybrid protests, with about 13,000 people participating in these events. The background story against this is a call by the left politician Sarah Wagenknecht and feminist activist Alice Schwarzer, who've written a manifesto for peace, which got about 650,000 signatures previous to these protests. And then they mobilized on the occasion of the first anniversary and gathered a group of 13,000 participants. They had hoped for more based on the manifesto, but these protests were part of a larger controversy because the boundaries in terms of political orientation of this event were not clear, and the two organizers were asked previous to the event to demarcate themselves, their event, from right-wing groups. They left this, in my view, intentionally open, and we had a situation where a very diverse set of actors participated, including right-wing figures that mobilized for peace, including various conspiracy protagonists within the German political sphere. We are missing, unfortunately, data on this event. We organized a survey on the day before, but we, for logistic reasons, couldn't do one on that day of the Wagenknecht and Alice Schwarzer protest. So this is something where we are missing exact figures, but we do know, of course, from observations that some of these right-wing groups were participating. Fourth, we did see some far-right protests for peace in Ukraine. Right? For example, organized by the AfD, with the argument, for example, to protect German economic resources. And this is something that perhaps is not unique to Germany. We've seen in some countries too, for example, in Poland, where also the right wing has mobilized against the war as not our war, right? But that's just to mention this. I'd like to zoom into these different stances on the war by these different mobilizations by looking into a survey that we did do on the day of the anniversary, so the 24th of February. Larissa, Maya, and me, we did a survey on both sides of the Brandenburger Tor to cover protests that were taking place on these two sides. On the one side, there was the big march in solidarity with Ukraine, calling for just peace, with about 120,000 participants, organized by, among others, by the Green Party and some diaspora groups. And on the other side of the Brandenburger Tor, at the same time, there were smaller protests organized by traditional peace groups, which was significantly smaller. Right? This was only 400 people, and as I said, it would have been actually a better comparison to follow the protests organized by Wagenknecht and Alice Schwarzer on the next day, on the 25th, which brought together about 13,000, as I said. In our survey, we followed the kind of established procedures outlaid by Walgrave and others for these kind of protest surveys, and we've done them in several other protests before. And what I briefly wanted to show you is the diverse stances on the war within these two protests. So again, we have the small peace protest on the one side of the Brandenburger Tor, and on the other hand, on the other side, the big solidarity and just solidarity for Ukraine protest. And what you see in this graph is that on each of these statements about a war, we have opposing opinions at these two rallies, right? In the Just Peace rally, with a strong disagreement about the fact that the war in Ukraine can only be solved through diplomatic means. This is, of course, something, not surprisingly, that the Just Peace rally strongly disagrees with, the Peace rally strongly agrees with. And this continues, and I think this is not too surprising across the different statements here. Also with regards to European security, that it must be continued cooperatively in cooperation with Russia, and this is again, of course, something that the Just Peace really strongly disagrees with, but the Peace rarely agrees with. And I'm not going to take you through all of these, but I wanted to show the very strong different stances here that in a paper that we published also at the ECPR, we argued actually in their opposition, they actually go even beyond the calls of the protests. So I think this is something of a kind of interesting, kind of polarizing dynamic within these protests, taking very strong or the protest participants taking very strong or opposite stances on the war, and which also kind of exceeds the differences to some degree in general public opinion. Okay, what does this tell us about the progressive peace movement in Germany? Actually, when we started working on this, we did a survey in 2022, so in the early phases of some of the Easter marches, local Easter marches. And perhaps a bit naively, we assumed that these protests, the Easter marches, would greatly profit from, in terms of increasing numbers of participants, from the Ukraine war. And what we found, and I have already said this, is a very low turnout at these protests. They have in some places they have increased in contrast to previous Easter marches, but not by the amount that we had expected them to increase. And one of the reasons, at least what we argue in the paper that we published about this, is that it was very hard for these peace groups to align their claims to the broader public discourse. And as I've mentioned, the broader public discourse here was largely supporting weapons deliveries, was largely supporting the right of Ukraine to self-defense, and so calls for a ceasefire and calls for an immediate stop to weapons deliveries were perceived as a kind of unjust win to one side, right? That the peace movement was criticized here, or these peace mobilizations, for basically wanting a loss for Ukraine, an unjustified loss for Ukraine. The other thing I would argue is that that this has to do with difficulties in building broader coalitions. And we've seen, I've mentioned earlier, that in the 90s and 2003, peace protests we did have, even though smaller than other countries, we did have a broader range of issues coming together, of progressive actors coming together on the issue of peace, including trade unions in both cases. So both in the 90s protests and in the 2003 protest, we have seen that trade unions have been involved in the peace protests in Germany. In the case of the 90s, also some of the parties, including the SPD, was part of the protests. But this is something that apparently is much more difficult in the current situation. And I'll talk about some of the reasons in a minute. But what we see as a result is that there's actually no kind of progressive joint mobilization on peace. Right? We have a different progressive mobilizations on Ukraine war. Instead, we have seen, and as I've tried to illustrate with the details about the Wagenknecht demonstration, we have seen a situation where the term peace is kind of bringing together right-wing and left-wing actors. Right? I'm not trying to say with this that formerly progressive peace activists are now right-wing, right? But at least what we see, and which is why I use the term hybrid, is that they are willing to mobilize together, right? So in a way, you could perhaps say, or wonder in how far peace is a kind of bridging bridge between some left and right-wing actors. I'll come to this in a second. And so what we see is that peace is being kind of claimed by various actors in different ways. And in a way, this doesn't help the situation of what I call the traditional peace groups, right? Because this is a rather contested concept. How did we get here? And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but I did wanted to share some thoughts about this with you here. And again, this is not a complete list for sure, and I'm happy for us perhaps to continue this discussion after my talk. So one of the things, of course, the broader context is perhaps what you can see a bit of a generational effect, with the kind of the lessons from World War II kind of waning off a bit and making it less attractive to be active in general pacifist mobilizations, right? Second, I would mention the kind of branching out of the peace movement in Germany, where we've seen that parts of the tradition or parts of the peace movement have moved into different institutionalization processes, including with parts of the former German peace movements being part of the Green Party, right? The Green Party's foundation was also incorporated many peace activists, right? And this, of course, as we've seen, the Green Party taking now a very different stance to the Ukraine war than some of the other peace groups makes the situation more complicated. In general, also, of course, the surge of the new right and the right has something to do with this. We know that generally far-right and particularly fascist groups actually are big supporters of war in general. But what we see, and this is something that is not unique to Germany, is where right-wing groups have mobilized against war if it kind of suited their political games and goals. In particular, with regards to the Ukraine war, of course, there's the element of supporting Russia's stance here and protecting national resources, which is another argument that is often made. As I said, this is not unique, and is also not unique to the current situation, though I would say that there's perhaps an increase in a kind of a right-wing dynamic on peace. Just one example, though, from the past, we have seen that in the protest against the Gulf War in France, for example, there have been right-wing groups also opposing peace. However, they were not involved in the demonstrations. So this is a different, perhaps new quality here that we do see also right-wing groups mobilizing on this. And certainly with a new right, which generally, with a big N, and particularly new right, where generally the goal is, of course, to adapt to generally accepted societal discourses, perhaps it's not too surprising, one could say, that the peace concept is also being kind of appropriated within new right discourses. Also, one might wonder why actually progressive peace movements, peace activists were joining these hybrid protests, right? And there's various speculations and also public debates about this. And I'm not going to go into all of this, but there's, of course, certain overlaps or docking access points in framing. And they have to do with certain anti-American and anti-Semitic strands within peace mobilizations across Europe, which there's a literature about, in case you're interested, that traces anti-Americanism, but also anti-Semitism in parts of peace mobilizations across Europe. And again, I'm not saying that peace movements per se are increasingly anti-Semitic or anti-American, but there are strands within it and certain frames that then right-wing actors can link to, and where then we find ourselves in a situation where right-wing and left-wing actors jointly mobilize on peace. Exactly. Beyond that, these kind of framing overlaps, I'd also like to talk about well, tradition is maybe the wrong word, but I'd like to talk kind of infrastructural and network build up over the last years. And what I would argue is that there is a certain build up and path dependency of different hybrid events in Germany over the last years. And the situation on peace that we have seen and that I've tried to describe also has to do with the fact that we've seen these kind of collaborations on these hybrid events in other contexts. And one of the perhaps most obvious examples are the protests against the COVID restrictions. You might have heard about the fact that in Germany and also other places, in Germany in the context of the Querdenker movement, we have seen something that is very clearly what I would call a hybrid protest with left and right-wing protesters coming together. This is perhaps the more obvious example. And my point is here that these kinds of joint mobilizations in also your sense of eventful protest, they build networks that then later mobilizations can build on. And this is partly the part of the story, I think, of these hybrid protests on peace, that they can build on hybrid protests on other issues before as I said, on COVID restrictions. But, and this is perhaps the less obvious example, there were protests in 2014 in the context of the annexation of Crimea that were called peace vigils for Monday peace vigils. And we actually, back then, we did a survey with a team in Berlin, and we were very surprised about our findings, right? And when we were now asked about the COVID events and also about the Wagenknecht demonstrations, also by press, we couldn't help to see overlaps with these early events. So what happened in these Monday vigils for peace? Again, also Ukraine, but 2014, when the issue wasn't as big yet. And we see a very hybrid protest here with a lot of conspiracy. Back then, was something, so think again, 2014, this is something that we were very surprised about. So what we found doing the survey is a strong mix of right-wing, left-wing positions within this protest and a strong reliance on conspiracy theories in this context. Not all of those participants, of course, but a big part. And so here, as I hope I'm making clear, you see a certain continuity in kind of hybrid events that can, to some degree at least, build upon each other in terms of networks. And we do know that networks of actors have continued through these events, even though the issues are different ones, right? We've seen this from the Monday Villages on Peace 2014 to the Querdenken protests in 2020, 21, and we see this again here now, I would argue, in the hybrid protests on peace. Yes, I'm almost done. And actually like to come to some first concluding remarks. So what I've tried to talk about briefly, let's come back to the beginnings, is of course a diversity of mobilizations across Europe with some similar trends across different historical periods. I've also talked about these new waves, which I think require us to look very closely, and this is, as I said, work in progress, look more closely at how these new waves compared to earlier waves of protest events, of peace protests, in terms of the alliances and coalitions that are part of this, and also in terms of the ways in which peace is framed. And this is something that I'm sorry to not be able to present you anything on yet, but this is something that we are working on. Then I'd like to talk a bit about what perhaps this particular situation in Germany tells us, without trying to overgeneralize too much, of course, because I know that some developments are also just particular. But I do think it invites us to thinking, or discussing at least, about the boundaries of what we call peace movements, right? And there's different options to it. And I don't want to say that, the broader term where you would include left and right in it should be chosen, but I think this is something that these developments invite us to discuss. We know that large parts of the literature on the peace movement focus on progressive peace movements, right? So this is the background against which I say it raises the question, in how far do we consider a more diverse, also academically and in research, peace movement, and include also right-wing actors in this, and this is also something that we wonder in our project, or do we talk about perhaps rather different strands of peace movements, and does this make more sense? Beyond the point of kind of including the different ideological orientations here, I think there's a need to also talk about diversification more generally. So beyond the question of whether to include regressive forces in consideration of peace movements, I think we need to talk about diversification more generally. Of course, the peace movements have never been a monolithic actor. But at the same time, we see with these newest wave also some perhaps new actors and actor constellations coming into play, including the role of migrant activists on issues of peace in the context of the Israel-Hamas conflict, but also other actors that I think deserve then more consideration and a discussion about diversification of the peace movement. And I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Priska, for this informed and stimulating talk. We have two discussants. I will start with Lorenzo Zamponi, and then from the Scuola Normale Superiore, and then Lorenzo Bosi from the Scuola Normale Superiore as well. Lorenzo, please.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, Priska. Okay, very interesting reconstruction, not only for your recent research on the mobilizations regarding Ukraine, but also for the historical reconstruction, because I think we are at a stage now with more than 30 years of post-Cold War Europe, in which we can understand many more things from a historical point of view, okay, and trace more long-term trends rather than focus on the individual episode of mobilization like we've done regarding these movements until now, okay. And obviously there is a problem, okay, whenever we deal with peace movements, okay. This was already really clear. I'm thinking about Donatella's early work on the peace movement in Italy in the 80s and so on, that the peace movement is inherently plural and composite. And thus, identifying its own identity is challenging. And also, this can create difficulties in tracing the borders of the concept. What is a peace movement and what is not? Okay, so I'm going to provide here one reflection on that, and then an element more on the historical view. Because definitely there are shades of peace movement, and we have to discuss on where do we trace a border. And obviously, I think that it can be it can provoke definitely a discussion, the classification as a peace movement, both of the kind of mobilization you were describing as just peace, okay, and also the mobilization in solidarity with Gaza now. There are two cases in which, in different ways, calling it a peace movement challenges the most traditional image we have of a peace movement. There are cases in which it's very easy to understand this is a peace movement. Vast anti-war demonstrations regarding Iraq in Italy and the UK in 2003. Our government is going to war. We do not side with anyone on the conflict. We're simply against the fact that our government is going to war. This is very straightforward, okay, to identify as a peace movement. It is already challenging to identify as a peace movement the mobilization regarding Gaza now, in which definitely there is an element of mobilizing for peace. Okay, there is a military intervention in Gaza, and many people are against that. But there is also another layer, which is the solidarity with one side. Okay, and so I can participate because I'm against the military intervention, but I'm also participating in solidarity with what I consider historical injustice. Okay, and these two things go hand in hand in this specific case, but not in general. So we haven't seen peace demonstrations with the same composition during the Second Intifada, because many of the people siding with Palestine recognized the legitimacy of an armed struggle in that context. So in this case, this is definitely already hybrid, okay, in which you have the peace element, but you have also that solidarity with one side of the conflict. And there is also another layer which makes it a bit more difficult, is that there is no direct involvement of our governments, okay, which is already the historical comparison with this could be protest against the Vietnam War, in which, sure, it was against the US intervention, but there was also a strong solidarity with a specific struggle in that area. And the two things went together and intertwined but remained from the conceptual point of view two different things. And when we analyze them, I see why we can analyze them as a peace movement, because it is so, but always keeping in mind, okay, that there is this peculiarity that makes it different from the example I was making before of the Iraq war movement, in which it's really no one was in solidarity with the Saddam Hussein government, okay? Of course, another layer of complexity is with what you were calling the just peace movement. Even, you know, I saw the problematic element of considering the Gaza protest as peace movement, but I can understand why it's a bit more difficult to me in that case, because these are protests in which people are demanding to go on, that our government goes on with military aid. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. They might be right. But it's, you know, it can be justifiable demands, which are very difficult for me to categorize as a peace movement. Sure, there is the idea that there is an unjust aggression, but there is the idea of defeating this unjust aggression through military intervention. You can call it an anti-authoritarian movement, an anti-imperialistic even movement. Calling it as a peace movement when you're actively siding with a military solution for the conflict, to me is, you know, it goes even beyond, okay, in stretching the limits of the peace movement. And as I say, you know, it's very difficult, okay, because these are, you know, borders which have many different shades and many, but I think definitely there is a discussion to be made on this. Traditionally, okay, the anti-war movement had both the opposition to military intervention, and also there is the idea of being against a culture of war. Okay, it can be from a religious or moral or non-violent point of view. It can be more in a political terms from an anti-imperialistic point of view, in which I see war as something which is an expression of oppression and so on and so forth. But there is an element of being against war, okay? And if I don't see that, okay, it's definitely difficult, which I see partially in the Gaza thing, and almost not at all in the just peace thing. So this is a bit problematic for me. The second thing I wanted to say, that I think the data you presented is very interesting for the possibility to trace some long-term historical trends, okay, and especially the end of the Cold War, okay, and how this has changed the way in which international politics works, and also the way in which military interventions take place and in which opposition to military intervention takes place. We've seen an increasing frequency of military intervention by European governments, okay, exactly as a consequence of the end of the Cold War and the construction of a new political equilibrium. But I think we are witnessing, and it's something on which our research on the peace movement, I think, should partially focus, the growth of a humanitarian discourse on war, okay? Which is something that is not been invented in 1989, okay? The doctrine of the just war was written by San Tommaso d'Aquino, okay? But definitely, okay, war, the depiction of war as, you know, more from an end of history, clash of civilization point of view, in which the righteous Western civilization brings justice, okay, is something that is extremely powerful, okay, and it's been, you know, going back and forth, and until a few months ago, we could have thought about that as something characterized in the early 2000s, but now it's once again very, very present in our public debate, and it's something that wouldn't have made sense within the context of the Cold War, in which there was also an ideological conflict at the world level. And this, I think, is interacting a lot, but these, of course, are anecdotal observations that you can definitely investigate empirically. The interaction between this growth of the humanitarian discourse on war, and so the justification of war from a moral point of view, how it interacts, with different anti-war political cultures at the national level. And thinking about countries like Germany or Italy, in which there was definitely strong anti-war political cultures for obvious historical reasons, and in which there is the need of this strong humanitarian discourse of war in order to create some popular support for military intervention, which is still in the minority, of the people, but it's increasing, You see it in the polls that more and more people find that in some cases military intervention is okay. And this is, I think, part of the long-term trend of making war legitimate again, even in countries that after the trauma of the Second World War was considering that, war has to be avoided in any case. And I think that this moral argument, which is obviously strongly linked with US culture, but it's something which is more and more widespread in European culture, is something that we have definitely to take into account. And I think this also probably interacts with the generational elements you were pointing out, on the fact that it is older generations that are more attached to the peace, as an issue, as a political claim, in comparison with younger generation that I think grew up already within this new humanitarian war discourse. And on the last point, I think it's very interesting what you were saying at the end on this hybrid, cases of mobilization, because definitely there are continuities. Now, conspirationism is a weird political category, and not sure to what extent it makes sense, but definitely in the opposition to whatever seems to be connected with global powers. So it has to do with COVID, it has to do with the war, it has to do with climate change, and so on and so forth. Definitely it's visible also in Italy, the construction of a new libertarian right political culture that self-defines as in opposition to anything that the global elite seems to say, And this is definitely something interesting to investigate.
Thank you, Lorenzo. The other Lorenzo, please.
Thanks a lot, Priska. Well, it was a presentation that was trying to manage, very different areas, and also, I would say, different research questions. I think I'm somehow close to Lorenzo in pointing at, we need to define what is the peace movement. Also, in order to find the best instruments to study this movement, and particularly the methods for studying. And here, is my question, my comment that is related with, mainly your first part, the evolution of the peace movement. You have traced this evolution based on protest event analysis, and I wonder if that is, the correct methodological instrument for tracing an evolution of a movement, where it's very hard to see the movement itself, its agency. You see more opportunities and change of context at the international, at the national level, but we have very little knowledge of the strategies, the alliance that you were like suggesting that you will cover like in this new project that I think is central to this type of movement. But when you study like with protest event analysis, this is hardly like achievable. Also like something that like this movement and what, for example, historians have done is like tracing like the international ties between like actors within the peace movement in being able to like build an international dimension of the peace movement. But also like the agency is not there because there is no like knowledge of how like peace activists themselves perceive, like whether they achieve some results with the peace movement and with their protest and with their form of action. And that is, I think, problematic if we try to like do an evolution of a movement without taking in consideration the movement in itself, but rather like the protest in the street that is part of, of the movement. I see rather like, this work you are developing on Germany and that goes in the direction where I would see like more in depth. And for this, I strongly agree. I think still like possibly like something that would be like interesting, not to say like that comparison across case is not relevant, but it is relevant, but rather like also like to look at the alliance across border. That is something that seems like that for this type of movement would be like very like relevant and very like interesting to study and to investigate in order like to show how like international it is. And also like this would allow also to look at the international dimension in terms of political opportunity. Okay, Cold War and ending of the Cold War, but international dimension in other like, phases of the peace movement is relevant in order to like understand what happens at the country level and then at the social movement level. And that is something that, I would suggest to look at.
Thank you. Priska, I think you have enough questions to address them now, and then we open the floor.
Thanks so much for these two comments. I really enjoy engaging about this with you. I'll begin from the back with Lorenzo Bosi with your comment. Also, just for clarification, I agree with you that, of course, protest event analysis here has its limits. Briefly about the 4 phases, these are identified in various studies, also qualitative studies on the peace movement. So this is not something that I identified based on PEA, but this is something that I found in various larger or longitudinal studies on the peace movement. So just to clarify. But I completely agree that if we want to understand, or that is important for also the current situation to understand the motivation of these and the dynamics behind the current protests, that we need other data. And actually, as you mentioned, in the project on the German peace movement, we'll focus very much on internal interpretative conflicts between different groups, also very local peace groups. So we'll start with the mapping of all the groups that were involved in the 2022-2023 various peace protests, and then look into each of them in detail. Maybe not each, but into a selection of these various ones, looking at their framing of the issue, doing interviews with them to really understand the interpretation, also struggles that are going on the concept of peace and what is understood as as a valuable and justifiable peace mobilization, and what the term peace includes and not, right? We know that, of course, that, and I'm not talking about what Lorenzo Zamponi mentioned. I think the borders are clear here, but even within the different peace groups, there's varying levels of the degrees of pacifism as a goal, right, or as a overarching, very generalizing goal. And so this is one of the things we plan to do. And I think the alliances across borders also will be very, very interesting here. I think the point that you both raised is, and I find it very interesting, is of course the broader context of peace mobilization and what has changed in a way. And of course we have now a very long period of, or relatively long period of post-Cold War. And we know also from international relations studies that the situation of the humanitarian interventions is also not a new thing, right? So I think the question that, so I'm just agreeing with both of you and following up on the argument that I think it's very fruitful to think about what the kind of new qualities of humanitarian intervention and what it means for peace movements, also in a kind of incremental, generational way of thinking. What does it do, this now not new, but continued situation of humanitarian intervention wars? What does it do to the peace movement? What does it do to general ideas in population? Lorenzo Zamponi, you mentioned it, on war and perhaps a certain growing acceptance of certain moral view of yes, military intervention as justified. And I think one thing to consider here, and this comes a bit back to the international context, is also that, of course, the more you use moral justifications for war, the more arbitrary it becomes, right? In a way. So here I think the kind of the increase in number of years of humanitarian intervention wars makes a difference qualitatively, because it makes it more and more arbitrary. I think to many parts of peace activists anyway, but, and this is something I think we see also with the most current situation, also in a kind of north-south difference, where in many southern countries, this is just perceived as completely arbitrary, right? And this is what I talked about also with the kind of new constellation of diaspora and migrant activists involved in this, where of course also I think the kind of incremental use of this kind of war and just kind of justification also of war also creates a sort of general injustice frame, if you will, for peace mobilizations, right? That also has to do with North-South and other kind of global inequalities. But I think this is something definitely to pick up, and also the generational differences. Perhaps more concretely about the Ukraine protests, Lorenzo, I would agree with you that I wouldn't call the solidarity with Ukraine protests as peace protests. However, I think they're interesting because they also use the term. And so I completely agree with you that generally they support a military solution, so it's hard to call them a peace movement. Yeah? But at the same time, they challenge the other peace movements, and they challenge the use of the term peace, because they also claim it, at least to some extent, for themselves in the context of a just peace. And I think this is, or I was referring to it as part of the kind of conundrum for some of the traditional peace mobilization, that this term is being kind of used in various ways, including by the solidarity protest, as well as, of course, including by right actors, which is a different thing, but still it complicates the use of this term. And in a way, it also here stipulates a debate about what do we actually talk about, right? And I think here you see parallels to also, of course, the use of the word democracy that is also being appropriated and also makes it hard in parts to simply use, right? As it's appropriated by right-wing groups, but this is perhaps a different story. I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks so much, and I look forward to further questions.
Thank you. Please. This because I think they are recording. Thank you.
My name is Evi Hadzopoulou, and I'm also visiting scholar here. I have a question because there is something that really concerns me looking at food movements and to what extent movements that are broad or focus on a concept or a topic are what do these, which is related also to the hybrid mobilization that you mentioned. Because for me it is important to what extent ideology plays a role in these movements and what really means for influence and change or inspiring people to contribute and participate. And I think it is related to what Lorenzo said, what is really their influence and their impact in the long run. Because when I think of movements, for example, I'm Greek in origin, movements anti-Americanist, anti-NATO, anti-capitalist, they had a very important ideology in the core, and that meant that not even people from the center politically would be part of these movements. And what does this really mean for the long run about mobilization and movements? Are these initiatives that bring in different types of people and how they can change the world in the long run, which is also related to what is happening in the different political arenas. Like we have socialist political parties adopting similar policies with right-wing political parties.
Thank you. I collect a couple. Mario Pianta.
Thank you very much. Excellent discussion. I would add 2 points. One, on the historical dimension, I think in the reconstruction we should pay more attention to the Balkan wars, not just Kosovo, but Bosnia, and not only because this was a natural development for Southern European countries in particular, I'm not sure about Germany, moving from a perspective of East-West to a post-Cold War world where the generating sources of war become ethnic conflicts, nationalism, and the idea of breaking up. So, and the response were less mass demonstrations, so you don't see them in your data, but much more this solidarity, bottom-up networks and presence of peace activists in areas of conflict, efforts of favoring dialogue between groups and so on. So this, I think, was an important turn which adds depth to the not just peace activism as an opposition to war in abstract or to war in other places or demands to governments to act in one way or another, but also the direct activism in that regard. By the way, in 1990, 2,000 Italian peace activists went to Jerusalem for the Peace Now, Time for Peace event, linking up with Palestinian and Israeli activists. And so even in the context of today's tragic situation in Israel and Gaza, this lesson of historical mobilization from the bottom up is, I think, very important. And it's important that this type of memory is not lost. So the dimension of international solidarity as a way in which bottom-up activism can operate, which is present in the Ukraine as well, with a lot of real peace activism taking the form of bringing aid to or supporting conscientious objectors, or as we have been doing here at Scuola Normale with the Scholars at Risk initiative for giving opportunity to scholars who object to the national positions to continue their work. So I think this element adds some depth. A second element is the point about the humanitarian legitimation that many of you raised is clearly very important as a way of re-legitimizing the possibility of war. But here I think a key element is the alignment between government political positions in particular contexts, on particular conflicts, and the element of opposition or support. And so probably a typology of different contexts could be useful in more generally on the issue of what is peace, what is a peace demand. I think we are not addressing this question for the first time. Peace research, Johan Galtung, there is a whole literature that since the 70s and 80s, but also in the 90s, developed this, and the idea of positive peace is exactly an answer to the need to qualify some of these elements. I don't know if Martin wants to add more, because there is already a theoretical, conceptual, and also practical elaboration on this, which can qualify peace and avoid the instrumental attitudes in some of these cases. Thank you.
Thank you. I will add a question to this one, because when you listed the explanations, you didn't mention political opportunities, especially for the German case, which seems to me a potential important explanation for a trend that only to a certain extent is present also in other countries. And there, the fact that you have SPD and Green in government, but also with the strong competitive attitudes by the Green that made very much a turn towards support for any type of war, and a very weak SPD leadership, I think, could also explain some specific elements, low mobilization capacity, the mobilizations around strange people, hybrid people like Sarah Wagenknecht, which I don't think were similar in other countries. And in this sense, I think you are right in looking also at the emergence of new hybrid protests that are related also with the anti-vax. And I think they're mainly dominated by the right wing, with some strange representative of small sects in the left in the different countries. But also a broader question would be what happens to social movements in Germany, because it is not only in this wave of protest, for instance, about Palestine, that Germany shows to be quite weak, the mobilization capacities, but also, as you mentioned, already in previous waves, it was the case. So while it was very strong, the peace movement in the 50s, and this is what also Dieter has pointed at a lot, but then support declined, and it was very clear in your protest event analysis that the green that you put, the color for the German cases was declining, UK was increasing, and so. But also the anti-austerity protests. So I think that also there, Germany was visible for the lack of mobilizations. And so I wonder also to which extent this type of trend, low mobilization capacity in general, could be introduced. And then repression, because while in the past, in some ways, the peace movements enjoyed broad support, now there is a discursive also closing of opportunities, and so which is different in different countries.
No. Thanks so much for these three very informed comments. I think I can simply agree with most of the points, but I'll not make my life too easy and just say yes, but try to add something too. No, I agree. It's again, from the back, Donatella, I completely agree. The political opportunity structure there is important. I didn't include it in the list, but of course, with pointing to the public discourse and the elites generally supporting it, you're absolutely right. This has been an important factor, and it links up to what Lorenzo was saying earlier, that of course part of this dynamic of these hybrids, or however you want to call them, is also kind of a general opposition to anything the kind of political elite does. And so I think you're absolutely right that the dominant, and which was also perceived as such, the dominant discourse and the mainstream discourse supporting the military weapons deliveries and the support of the war was something that also could be constructed as quite usefully in a way, as something to oppose against, and which drew broad spectrum of people, including from the left and the right. And so yes, definitely it plays an important role. The discourse of closing too, and I think perhaps I haven't stressed this enough, but there was really a very harsh public debate about the Wagenknecht protest, of course, too, but also about other peace protests, right? And how could they, in this context, stick to their calls for disarmament. And so there was very little possibilities to link it to the public discourse. So yes, it is like a closing discursive opportunity structure, and also to some degree, maybe now more than with Ukraine, of kind of also restrictions that we see there, definitely. A decline overall, I think it's something interesting to think about, because there's elements that of course still active, and I think it's rather an issue of can they get active in a kind of in a broader alliance, because, well, as you know better than I, the left is very divided, and I think what I've tried to describe with regards to the peace, I think it's part of this element of also divisions then on peace, with some parts active in different demonstrations on peace, right? Yes, so I think this is something to further look into. I'd also like to come back to your reference to the long literature on peace, and of course there have been both in kind of practical as well as in theoretical terms long elaborations on the concept, and this is something that actually we would like to include in our analysis of these internal struggles on peace, because we really want to look into detail of how this is understood in the present mobilizations, because I think this is something that we can't take for granted. There are, of course, all these differences that have already been spelled out on different conceptions, but I think is very interesting to look in how do the present activists understand it, what ideas of and boundaries of the term do they adhere to, where do they draw the line, where do they perhaps do not draw the line and have elements of certain ideas of just interventions to some degrees, right? And this is something that we really are very interested in, also in an attempt to link some of the literature on social movements with literature in peace and conflict studies, right? And so this is something that's definitely on our agenda, even though we are just starting with this. So this I can emphatically say yes, yes to. And then again, also, of course, I completely, so I admit to being guilty on not reflecting on and I've mentioned it briefly, on the direct action involved on peace activism, absolutely. And I think it has something to do with also the fact that it's also not existed in some of the existing overviews of mobilizations, like the one I was referring to too, of course has to do something with the fact that once you zoom out, it's much easier to overlook these very concrete solidarity activities, and it's much easier to abstract on the level of these big events, right? And even there, I would see difficulties, because these were called international mobilization cycles, but actually the degree to which they were linked internationally, and you referred to this too, is very different. So so actually the kind of transnational dimension of this varies. But yes, definitely point taken. We need to look into more of this. It's just methodologically often harder to catch. And this is why many studies do not do it. And I hope that in our project on the German one, we will definitely do it because we will have 3 years to look into very detailed and into these varied groups and their activities. So this will go beyond the protest on the street. For our comparative project, we also, I forgot to mention this earlier, we don't plan a PEA. What we plan to do is look into framings of the calls through a selection, of course, because in a comparative setting you need to have some kind of selection, but a selection of calls and also interviews with activists. So here you have also this element that tries to cover let's say the meaning making a bit more or in a comparative setting. And maybe to your point very briefly, I think if I understood you correctly, you were wondering about the kind of does it need a diversity to be successful as a movement, right? And I think, I'm not sure if this is what you were getting at, but if you allow me to interpret it in this way, then I think this is something, and because you were mentioning the right wing and that, there were examples where successes or where changes have been effected with the far right. And I think studies show that there's a trade-off, right? And we know that some of the large mobilizations, and I'm not talking here about hybrid in terms of left and right, but large mobilizations, of course, have the problem that once they gather together a very diverse set of actors, their master frame gets very abstract, and as such, these kind of more abstract claims that are being made are also much harder to push through. Right? Like a thing, another world is possible, or or a call for a global justice. So this is something that has a certain trade-off. Yes, you increase the numbers and maybe the pressure, but at the same time, it makes it takes your claims off into a very abstract notion. This is something very now broad, but I'm trying to react to what you were saying here. Yeah, maybe you can specify if I haven't answered that.
Hybridization of the peace movement obviously is only insufficiently described in terms of a right takeover of the movement. It is not just a question of left and right protesters appearing in the same protest event, but it is certainly also to be explained as a kind of hybridization of the whole agenda of what peace is about, the meaning of peace. And so it means, in practical terms, if I decide to participate in a peace movement, I can no longer be so sure that this is actually a mobilization for peace. I might encounter people who actually defend the legitimacy of a military action, be it pro-Putin or pro-Hamas. And I think this is a quite existentialist experience for many peace protesters from the traditional peace movement. And I just wonder what are the consequences for this, for the movement in terms of mobilization. On the one hand, one could expect that the hybridization helps to mobilize more people. So it becomes more diffuse, so more people are willing to participate. On the other hand, one can expect that the hybridization scares off a certain amount of people. And I think this is quite unclear what it means in terms of mobilization. One could even think in terms of hybridization linking it to the militarization, because militarization or the support of military action is not hybrid. So if in Germany, for instance, the government and the Green Party as traditional supporters of the peace movement become increasingly support military action, it might also be related to this experience of hybridization. So providing less hybrid solutions.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Giovanni Scotto from the neighboring University of Florence. Thank you very much. It's been very inspiring. As a person who's trying to make sense of the difficulties or antinomies of the Italian peace movement these days, I think it was useful personally for me to analyze a little bit in depth the discursive practices instead of just focusing on actors. Sometimes even within the same tiny actor, you might have different discourses going on. Actually, well, we have different situation. One hypothesis could be that, or relative to Germany, one hypothesis could be that in the German case, and this is not new as well, in the German case you have, since you have a huge influx of refugees, you have a huge solidarity movement. And you might, if you stroll through Berlin and stroll to Florence, you will see in Berlin a lot of Ukraine flags, and in Florence basically no Ukraine flags at all. You see peace flags, and which in turn raise the question, what does this symbol stand for, as many of us have hinted at. But I think the issue of solidarity towards refugees is extremely important, and Germany has a 30-year story about this. So again, the Balkans have been, in my personal view, let's say the forgotten matrix of what we are experiencing now. Germany hosted 400,000 Bosnians, hosted 1 million Syrians, and now is hosting 3+ million Ukrainians. And this has led to a bottom-up mobilization for solidarity, which in turn has brought about mobilization and protest. We don't have in Italy such big solidarity protests pro-Ukraine. In fact, what we had is a very generic appeal, and then within this appeal, you would have tiny pro-Ukraine solidarity movement. Or in the case of City of Florence, you would have two different events on the occasion of the 24th. You would have the pacifists on the 24th and the Ukrainians on the 25th, basically with zero overlap, except basically. So I think the issue of refugees is important. The issue of change in demographics over the long time in Germany is extremely important. And looking methodologically at discourses rather than actors might open up a little bit of more complexity.
Thank you.
Eager to read the project at the end of the 3 years.
Thank you. Just a terminological issues, because in the past there has been different use of anti-war campaigns, which have always been more heterogeneous. Also, during the Vietnam War, there were peace movements that included groups pro-Viet Cong, for instance, or in the protest on all the waves that you mentioned, there were also different groups. But this was also captured by the idea of differentiating anti-war campaigns from the peace movement. And I wanted also to ask, what do you think about this?
Thanks. Thanks so much. Now, I'm really enjoying this discussion because it picks up many of the things we were discussing and thinking about. So your point about the hybridization, and in a way it links to what you were saying also. There's a certain kind of uncertainty about, about what is meant. What do others mean if they use this concept, right? And this is what we are interested in, and why we are so interested in these internal struggles or internal conflicts of interpretation, we call it, in terms of between different groups. Because maybe just a quick note, the network of German peace groups is very decentral, right? And contrast, it's similar to in other countries, but there's countries with a more centralized peace movement, right? And this is very decentralized situation in Germany, and we will find. I suspect that we'll find that different local groups will also do with this differently to a large extent, and also we're interested in within these groups, different understandings of the term, in particular in reaction to kind of public challenge or public criticism, which I think also forces many to defend this idea and perhaps also defend the boundaries of what is called peace. And your question also in a way refers to this, right, that actually peace used to be perhaps used in a way, in a more narrow way than peace movements rather than anti-war movements, as you were saying, right? With anti-war bringing together a more heterogeneous group of actors. And I wonder if that is still the case. I mean, we can decide how we call it academically, and we could still use peace versus anti-war, but of course we could also, but the other dimension of it is also how it is being used within among the politically active. So, and here we see that this term is very much being used in a very fast and loose way, one could say. And I think, so I would agree with you that it creates a certain uncertainty. We don't know that, you know, what kind of meaning of it and what kind of event is this now when I go to this. We do see also, and I think we can, and I hope we can bring some clarity to this in this project. We have seen that because we've done different, very local also protest surveys, and we have seen that there is local events. For example, we did a protest survey at the Easter March in Bielefeld, very specific. And there we find a very clear picture in terms of framing and in terms of a progressive orientation. There's no doubts about some of the boundaries that we're discussing here now. But this is unclear in other situations, and I think this is something that is very interesting to further look into. Yeah, thanks.
I can close with an advertisement. The research we are developing on the Italian and the German case, we would like to suggest it as a template to look especially at these two waves of mobilizations against wars, on the Ukrainian case and on the Palestinian case. And we will hope to involve other colleagues also from the United States with whom we are in contact. And the project, as Priska mentioned, is an open one to which any type of collaborations is invited. And so it would be an occasion to have Priska a lot with us, I hope. And also Priska will stay until the end of November. And for all those of you who would like to meet her, she will be available. Just send an email. Priska, thanks a lot. It has been a very interesting 2 hours conversations. Looking forward to our project.
Thanks so much for the discussion.